We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Kylie Stam. I'm the Diversity Program Manager for the Elliott School of International Affairs. This is day 3 of our Inclusive Excellence Week. So thank you to those who have been tuning in to a few sessions. I know that there's a lot going on this week, and so we're grateful to you all for joining us for such an important conversation. Before we begin formally, we just wanted to share that GW resides upon the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples who served as generations of the region long before we were there. And so we extend our gratitude to everyone who came before us. The session today, Navigating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in International Relations Schools, What's Underway, with Carla Capel, is a session I've been really looking forward to. We're grateful to Carla for being here with us to have this discussion. And so I'll go ahead and introduce you so that you can start hearing from her right away. So Carla is a senior advisor in Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and distinguished fellow for the Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace, and Security. She leads the Institute's effort engaging deans of international affairs and public policy schools from across the country in discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Capel recently served as vice president of the United States Institute for Peace. Prior to that, she served as chief strategy officer in the U.S. Agency for International Development and was appointed the inaugural senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment. She also directed the Institute for Inclusive Security, served as deputy assistant secretary for international affairs with the U.S. Department for Housing and Urban Development, and worked with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Carla, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. What I'm going to do is share my screen. And because we're a relatively small group, I have slides, but I'm going to run through those fairly quickly so that we can have more of a discussion. I know this is being recorded, so I will run through them for those who might watch afterwards, but I think conversation is more interesting. Hold on one second. So as you can see from my bio, I have spent most of my career actually as a practitioner, and I came to Georgetown, I will say happily, but out of a sense of frustration that issues related to equity and inclusion were not receiving what I believe to be the necessary attention in the practitioner community. And my hypothesis was that that was because people weren't learning about equity and inclusion issues when they were in school. And so they emerged and didn't realize how important they were. So I launched this project about 3 years ago, focused on how to transform education, international affairs education, particularly at the graduate level, to better look at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And since then, I have been involved in working with about between 2 and 3 dozen schools across the country of all different sorts to look at this issue and how we can transform the educational process and system to better address these issues. And so my conversation with you all today is reflective of what I have learned and observed and heard from deans and other administrators across the country. And I should say I'm meeting with your new dean next week to talk about the Elliott School, and previously Ruben Brigady and your interim dean were both on the University Leadership Council that I facilitate. Jonathan Walker has been part of some of those conversations as well. And I've been in touch with Shirley Graham in the course of doing this work too. So I feel like a distant cousin of the Elliott School and the good efforts that you all have been putting in on this agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is so important from my perspective and as a practitioner and research. Then I'll talk about the implications I think there are for higher education, and then some of the work around transformation that is ongoing. So there are 5 trends that I think mean that actually diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are becoming more important. One is that there is increasing overlap between underdevelopment and instability. And so we see that the number of underdeveloped peaceful countries is declining. And what that means is that issues of inequity, marginalization, and vulnerability are becoming increasingly part of a vicious cycle between underdevelopment, instability, and conflict. The second is that we see a lot of shifting demographics, which mean that there is growing diversity in countries around the world. We have the largest number of people who migrated in history and the largest number since World War II. They are driven both by economic mobilization and demographic trends. So aging populations in certain countries, a large youth population in other countries. They're also driven by dramatic evolution in technology. So we see that it's much easier to move around. It's much easier to feel contact with diverse populations within countries. We know that it's easier to stream information and to spread ideas, both positive and destructive, around the world. And that is all being resulting in a transformation in the way information flows and the causes and consequences of conflict and in the mix of people around the world. At the same time, we see changes in the combatants and tactics of conflict. So we see increasing mobilization of non-state actors around the world. We see increasing mobilization of civil society movements who are driving changes in the priorities and tendency to conflict, drawing attention to disparities, to marginalization, and to vulnerability. And then compounding on top of that are a growing set of economic and environmental imperatives, increasing inequality and climate change, which is already having devastating effects on the most vulnerable populations. So all of those trends, and I know I'm running through them quickly, but I know also I was instructed to focus particularly on what's going on around the world. So I'm happy to come back to the trends if that would be useful. But all of that means is that embedded are a broader diversity of voices who are influencing policymaking and program around the world, inequity and inequity driving greater challenges to fragility and development around the world, and a need to think about inclusion as a strategy for promoting peace and prosperity around the world. Now, we know that there's also an expanding imperative in the international community around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's long been debates around the extent of the moral and ethical imperative to drive forward commitments to equity and inclusion. We started this meeting by noting the role of Indigenous people in the historic lands in which we sit in Washington, D.C. Those kinds of obligations have been expanding, and they've been expanding in terms of their regime that's been put in place over decades that calls for equality and attention to different populations. Should I stop, Kylie? Is there something you wanted to say?
Your sound went out for a moment.
Oh, okay. Am I back?
Yeah, you returned to us.
Okay, great. So there's an expanding international human rights regime with legal obligations to a whole variety of distinct populations around the world, from people, indigenous populations, ethnic, religious, and racial minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus populations, women and girls, etc. At the same time, we also have a growing and incredibly persuasive body of evidence that shows that there's a very profound pragmatic rationale to pay greater attention to issues of equity and inclusion. So we know that there's incredible promise from inclusion. We know that societies benefit from greater voices being heard. We know that when we leverage and take advantage of the expertise and perspective of different populations, there are social gains. Leveraging them leads to stability and resilience. And we know that there are great perils in exclusion. So there are economic, social, and stability related costs when we look at marginalization, vulnerability, and exclusion that fester and endure. Looking a little bit more specifically and super quickly, we know that societies and communities benefit in important ways. From an economic standpoint, we know, for example, that we could have 150 million fewer hungry people if women, as one example, had equal access to resources on their farms. We also know that there are gains to having diverse boards of directors. McKinsey found that there's 53% great increases in returns on equity when you had diversity within the workplace. We also know that there are qualitatively greater gains in increased likelihood of the resolution of peace of conflict when we have women in civil society at negotiating tables. In fact, peace processes are 64% less likely to fail when we have women present. At the same time, we know that there are quantifiable losses to exclusion. We know there are trillions of dollars that are lost from gender inequality, hundreds of millions of dollars from LGBTQ plus discrimination, losses to food security, as I mentioned. And interestingly, we also know that there is a sort of that marginalization and exclusion are both causes and consequences of developmental stagnation and instability. So less developed and fragile countries and communities are more likely to enable marginalization and marginalization and exclusion undermine well-being and stability within societies. So what that means is there's really compelling case to be made for paying attention to these issues in the classroom as we develop the next generation of leaders. And it's very important to remember that when we look at the next set of statistics. So what do we know? What we know is that right now, very little of all that I've just said is being taught in schools. In public policy schools, we know that only 10% of syllabi gender and culture, race and ethnicity are explored about 7% of the time. Affirmative action is even debated only 6% of the time. Other dimensions of diversity, age, ability status, sexual orientation, national origin, religion, language are explored less than 5% of the time, which means we aren't even having these discussions in the classroom. In the case of international affairs schools, we know that fewer than half even touch on gender issues in their courses, though we know that at the Elliott School, there is a lot of coverage of gender issues. These are significant challenges and they interrelate to issues of representation. So, for example, we have underrepresentation of deans of IR schools, only 40% are female identifying and less than 20% are of diverse backgrounds. So the implications are that we need to think about how we revisit and transform education to address this critical sense of issues. Because right now, we're graduating generation after generation of student ill-equipped to think about or know about the research, the international human rights regime, and the compelling rationale to drive this forward. And one of the things that I've learned over the years I've been working with these deans is that the curriculum does go with the climate and in the school and the composition of the school. What do I mean by that? What I mean is we can make changes to the curriculum, but the ability to really operationalize robust discussions around sensitive issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion issues requires a permissive climate. And similarly, we know that the composition of the schools, faculty, staff, and students is essential to having that conversation and to putting in place the kind of robust curriculum and syllabi that we know that we need. So let me dive in just a little bit to both what it means to move curriculum, climate, and composition, and then how that's moving forward today. So when we talk about integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion issues into curricula, what do we mean? Well, essentially, we mean these 6 things. First, how are we thinking about the differences in different segments of the population, how they are affected and affected differently by different interventions? And the obvious one I'll choose right now is the coronavirus pandemic, because actually the media has done a reasonably good job of looking at disparities between, in the United States, African Americans, Latinx, and Native American populations, both their infection rates and their mortality rates, and that's been tracked. But even in that case, there are big blank spaces where we just simply don't have the data. But that discussion is incredibly important, and it enables people to understand how different reality can be for different sub-communities in populations around the world. The second is we need to understand how different background and identity change your perspective and the issues that you prioritize. And we need to think about and reflect on that in the classroom. Third, we need to be able to present the information about the legal frameworks and the data that mean that it is our obligation to pay attention to these things. I've been struck in my classes, which I offer at Georgetown, with how few people are even aware of the international human rights regime, how young that regime is, why it is born of World War II, and how it's been shaped over the intervening decades. And that really creates a big blank spot for international affairs professionals. We need to think about how we can host diverse guest lecturers and speakers in addition to diverse instructors, because students need to be able to see people who are leaders and established experts in the field who look like them and reflect their interest and expertise. We need to think about who we have that we're assigning in class syllabi and who the scholars are and whether they reflect different perspectives and different backgrounds. And further, we need to make sure that we are equipping students to manage and deal with diverse sets of stakeholders that they will encounter in the United States and around the world when they get out of school. So when we talk about embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in our syllabi and our curricula, that's what we're talking about. In terms of the climate, we need to think about the classroom environment. We need to think about the environment for faculty, students, and staff once they're there. We need to make sure that we are supporting first-gen students and students from different diverse groups and undergraduate students, as well as those with disability, to make sure that they feel welcome and are physically welcome on our campuses and in our spaces. We need to be aware of the specific challenges that international students face and how we're being supportive of them logistically. And then we need to also discuss efforts to create that inclusive climate on campus and how we're engaging the different members of the community in that work. When we talk about composition, we need to make sure that we're thinking about whether we have a diverse community and that our community weaves through the faculty, the students, and the staff. We need to make sure that we're enriching the pipelines. We need to make sure that we're eliminating bias. We need to be tracking and monitoring the status of our school composition. And we need to think about both recruitment and retention, because what we know is that the recruitment is the first step in the process, but that many of the faculty that we recruit of diverse backgrounds actually leave at a higher rate because they don't find a climate that is conducive to their success. So when I talk about these three interrelated aspects, I think that they are essential to a durable approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in school. But let's bear down a little bit more specifically on curriculum, because I know that that's where you're particularly interested. So what do we see going on today? Because actually one of the interesting results of the anti-racism protests that burst out in 2020 is actually a real window of opportunity and a lot of activity around this agenda in schools nationwide, often spurred by the activism of students that is animating a lot of like-minded faculty and staff in universities of all different types. So I'll give you some examples of the kinds of work that are going on in the places they're going on. At Georgetown, for example, we have started in some of our programs to survey syllabi on a voluntary basis to see the extent to which there are different scholars reflected and assigned in the classes and different perspectives being put forward. So we now have a sense of how many men and women are the authors of work being assigned in classes, how many people of diverse backgrounds, how many people from the global South. And actually, there's been an incentive system put in place to recognize those who are doing the best job and to offer assistance when people want to adapt their syllabi and increase the diversity of scholarship. A number of certificates and areas of study have been created. So, for example, at Tufts University, they had a focal area of study that was gender. That's now gender and social inclusion. Texas A&M, you guys, and Georgetown all have certificates related to different dimensions of gender. University of Washington has programs on disability studies, and there are other related certificates that allow people to focus on these issues and develop specific expertise. That said, I would note that these certificates serve a distinct sub-community of students, those who are really passionate about these issues. That doesn't necessarily reach the entire student body, which is pretty fundamental to actually transforming the field. Further, we've had the introduction of new classes and new core requirements. So for example, Harvard University this year at the Kennedy School introduced a 2-week intensive at the beginning of the semester called Race and Racism in the Making of the United States as a Global Power, which really tried to contextualize how the origins of race, slavery, and colonialism have shaped the system and served US interests, and how to transform and move away from that. Similarly, there have been a number of places where faculty work groups and faculty student exchanges have been set up. For example, at the University of Washington in the Evans School, they've created speed dating, where students and faculty go around and survey one another's syllabi to provide input and ideas for topics that are missing or potential readings that can be added. It's a voluntary exercise, but it enables the faculty to really crowdsource ideas for new topics and information to pull into their classes. At American University, they've hired a pedagogist who is not only helping with online learning and creating more engaging approaches to learning, but is also focused on how to weave a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion into the curriculum. And Tufts has created a library service center with experts related to diversity and inclusion who can work with faculty to identify resources that they can pull into their syllabi and into their courses. So these are all real-time examples of things that are being done, not just to move this agenda forward, but to make it easier to move the agenda forward by providing support, resources, and information about opportunities that exist to enrich syllabi and courses so that we can touch every student of international affairs and they can and faculty are better able to navigate the range of questions I mentioned earlier. Similarly, by creating these areas of specialization for those who are passionate, what we're doing is we're creating and enabling there to be a cadre of experts that can help serve the felt need in the practitioner community to have greater expertise in these areas. So what we're actually doing is enabling us to fill the jobs that are already vacant out in the world that students are eager to fill as gender advisors, as social inclusion advisors, and as experts in related fields. So, when I don't want to touch too long on composition or on culture, but I did want to at least mention that there are a lot of different ways that you can approach diversifying the composition of your faculty and your students, and that these are all supported by research showing that they are effective means to build a diverse community that will be more successful and leverage the wide range of expertise that is out there. Similarly, there is a lot of research that's been done about how to create an inclusive school culture. And I won't read a set of bullets, but what I will tell you is it's interesting to note for those faculty who may be on and say, I'd really like to do this, but I'm a little bit nervous about doing it because these are sensitive issues, that the research shows fairly persuasively, actually, that students appreciate you raising these issues, even if you say, I may not get this quite right, but I want to have this conversation and I want to let you express yourselves rather than papering over or ignoring these issues and letting them sort of simmer under the surface unaddressed. So the student bias now is towards engagement, however non-expert or tentative that engagement may be, rather than ignoring the existence of these issues and ignoring how to address them. There are a number of resources that are out there, and I've included the wonderful inclusive teaching resources that have been put together at GW. We also have put together an extensive portal, and I can put the links actually in the chat to that provides academic research by diverse scholars on a range of different issues that will be built out over the course of this year going forward, as well as an example of a portal on disability inclusive development, just because there are other programs that look at Indigenous people in New Mexico, LGBTQ community in New York, et cetera. But these are out there if you look for them. So it's not quite as hard as one might think to pull this material into syllabi. And then there will be this forthcoming edited volume that I've put together from Oxford University Press that will help enable us to teach these issues with much more facility, because I know it can be difficult to identify the research that I'm talking about. Fundamentally, our goal needs to be to create a research and learning ecosystem that really meets today's challenges. It's absolutely essential that we build and meet the needs of these gaps. We need to make sure that our work and our teaching aligns with contemporary research and practice, and we need to prepare students to navigate the world when they exit school. So with that, I will conclude, and I really look forward to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you. I've put you all to sleep. Go ahead, Rolly.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. That was really a great overview of so much. And so I wanted to ask, I have a lot of questions, but the one I'll just start off with one. You mentioned that you have some things to incentivize the move to a more diverse syllabus at Georgetown. And I was wondering what kind of incentives are you using?
So the first is recognizing achievement and accomplishment. So we make a very big effort to note those both who are creating diverse syllabi, who are addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in their classes, and who have shown improvement, who are making a commitment to advancing this agenda. So that's one piece. The second is we've started to do increased outreach around classes that are reflective of these activities to students, so that it's having a boost in enrollment because students are actually interested in these classes, which enables the classes not to be under-enrolled and canceled, and gives them then a boost in terms of outreach to the student population. The other thing that we've done is we've, and this is not our innovation, this is something that was innovated more at Tufts, but we've started to fund research assistants who can work with instructors and faculty to build the diversity into their syllabi. So it's not that an instructor or a faculty member is there alone in the wilderness trying to figure out what it is they can build in. It's they actually have assistants. And at Tufts, there were grants made available to the professors, but we've actually paid the research assistants and then made them available to the instructors. So the instructors can call on somebody to provide that kind of assistance that makes it a lot easier for them to do that. We also have within our Pedagogy Institute, there are small grants available for people who want to retool their syllabi. So they're like mini fellowship grants during a semester or over a summer to enable you to rework your syllabus to build in these concepts and also make it sort of pedagogically more engaging. So those are some examples.
If there isn't another hand, I will keep going. So, Kylie, let me know when there's another hand, okay? Based on what you just said right now, also, you mentioned that there's a way of signaling to the students which courses have made those moves so that they don't have low enrollment. How do you signal that to your students?
So there are a couple things. First of all, we just put in place a Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion last summer. And with that came a web portal and a newsletter and a Twitter feed. So those are now being used to increase information dissemination about it. The other thing that we do is we use the certificates that exist. So for example, the Gender, Peace, and Security certificate, just as one example, we identify the courses from the course catalog each semester, and then we go out to any student who has attended the events at the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and anyone who's expressed interest in the certificate, whether or not they're enrolled in the certificate program, with the list of courses that are covering these issues sufficient to satisfy the requirements of the certificate or that might be of interest. And so it has resulted in a nice little community of people who are helping us promulgate information about these courses. We also work with the relevant student groups to send out the information. So the students who are, interested in gender issues, or, women in the School of Foreign Service. So the student run groups that are interested in the issues we're talking about, DEI, gender, etc., are helpful for sending out word to students who are particularly interested in these issues. The other thing that we've done to enable these courses to thrive is we've put a lot of effort. So the courses that we offer are often unique, and I don't know as much about the Elliott School, but are often unique because they draw from across all of our programs. So we'll have students from a number of different programs, which is actually love, because they get to meet people who otherwise they would never meet, who are interested in similar issues. But in order to do that, we put a lot of effort into scheduling courses when they will work for the schedules of different programs. So every program has a different cadence of requirements. Some programs have summer sessions, some don't. Some, have free time in spring or in fall. Some have a lot of students who have outside employment. And so they prefer evening classes. So what we've done is we put a lot of elbow grease into figuring out when are the windows that will allow the maximum number of students to enroll who are interested, because it will fit into the space that they have outside of electives, internships, and other jobs. And we're now in the process of making sure that these courses increasingly can satisfy, if not core requirements for degrees, then distribution requirements for degrees. So that even if you don't want to be a gender advisor or a social inclusion advisor, but you're interested in these issues, this will meet one of the requirements for your core degree so that you can get some introduction to these issues, and that it will count towards your degree. It's not a pure elective in that sense. And that's actually paid huge dividends, because it used to be that some of these courses end up under-enrolled because they sort of just got scheduled and they didn't fit with many people's set of core requirements. So that has had a big impact as well.
And it leads me to the next question, which is about core requirements. So we have, as all universities do, the core classes, which often have a very standard curriculum or almost textbook type approach to certain topics. For example, theories of international relations or something like that. What approach have you seen that deals with diversifying courses like that may be a little bit less diverse?
So I've seen 4 approaches, and I won't name any names either at Georgetown or elsewhere, but I will tell you which ones I think work the best. So in order of, I'll start from the bottom and I'll work my way up. So some people have inserted sort of certain sessions that cover other critical theories, feminist IR, other topics, women, peace, and security, race and racism in IR as a session or a few sessions, usually at the end of the course. It is, let me say, better than nothing, but it's not great. And some of the students actually are offended by it because it really is sort of perceived as box checking and a literal add-on at the end of the course. So it's better than nothing. I don't want to argue, people are getting exposure to these, but it's not great. The second approach I've seen is where you are focused on the diversification of the scholarship within each of the modules, and the diversification of, for example, the parts of the world that you're looking at. And so you're bringing greater elements of diversity and inclusion into a classic discussion, which is giving you some exposure. And if you go to the portal at Georgetown, for example, we have a section which is IR theories and gives you both diverse scholars writing straight up on IR theories and intersections of DEI issues with IR theories. So you want a feminist critique of realism, it's by a woman from the global South, it's there. So you weave it in there, but you're still maintaining sort of the structure of the class as it was. So I think that's a little bit better than the first, still not great. The 2 that I really like and that I think are both the most engaging and the easiest once you embrace it, because you naturally bring forth a wider diversity of perspective and value. So one is to set up the course as a series of debates, debatable propositions that can start with debates around theory, but can get to then debates around contemporary issues. And that then enables you to set up the different perspectives in the structure of the course itself. And in doing that, you get naturally a diversity of scholars and a diversity of perspectives, because you're literally teeing up the class to provide that set of perspectives. The other is to go back and contest the theories yourself. So you approach it through the lens of history, and you apply and look at how you would look at these different theoretical notions or the historic perspective, and then what is the contestation of that? And so you're actually revisiting, what we would have learned in Intro to IR or IR theories, and then building the update into the way you're approaching it so that the students are engaging with the material and thinking about where they come out, rather than approaching all of these things as diktat. Because the problem is that when we look, if we look at IR only through the lens of a historic perspective, we are essentially reaffirming a very narrow take on the field. So we're foot stomping something which has been debated for the intervening, I'll speak for myself, 40 years of history without enabling students to understand that debate.
And to continue on that, thank you. Those were very nice 4 models, by the way. I like that. So now what if, let's go back one step further. So those 4 different techniques are all used by faculty who have accepted that this needs to be done.
So these are, I would say, I would put the first 2 in the category of people who have sort of accepted that it needs to be done. I mean, so yes, they admit there is a whole body of research out there on topic X, and their students are clamoring for it. And so they'll stick some stuff in there. The second approach, so let's call approach 1, tack it on. Approach 2, weave it in. That one is more likely the person who has looked at their syllabus and realized that they have 98% white men, mostly dead, and that probably doesn't make sense. And so they are the descriptive diversity of what is being encompassed is there. But now let me say, the second tactic can be really good, right? Depending on what you're choosing as a reading. I mean, in a perfect world, it would be woven in and all, but it can also be just sort of a tip of the hat, right? Okay, now I have some women in there. I've got some people of diverse backgrounds. Let's call it a day. The third, which is setting up as a debate, I actually heard from an instructor who, this was last year, suddenly there was a light bulb moment. They kind of got religion. And they said, okay, I'm going to rethink this whole thing. I've been looking at this for 20 years the same way. What if I look at it from a different way? And at first, the conversation I had with this person was, how am I going to do this? This is my syllabus. What are some options? And then by the time I got kind of back to them, they were like, no, I took care of it. It was easy. At big debates and the different perspectives, I'm weaving theory in, but I'm no longer like doing day 1 realism, day 2 constructivism. Like I'm covering it, but I'm covering in through the lens of contemporary issues. Now, the contemporary issues this person chose might not have been the ones I chose, but what they said was, once it was about contemporary issues, it became really easy to find diverse scholars because contemporarily there are tons of them. And so then that issue became, was taken away. And then with regard to the fourth one, I heard about it a few weeks ago because somebody was saying that the challenge that they had faced was that intro to IR often looks through the lens of history. And if you are only looking through the lens of history, you're stuck. That is, it becomes a history class. It's not actually a contemporary IR class. And that really, we shouldn't be teaching intro to IR as a history class. It's a different animal. And that when they understood that, then it was a paradigmatic change in their mind about what it meant to teach intro to IR.
Thanks. Now, what if you have certain classes and you know that the faculty have not been convinced that this diversification needs to happen, that they firmly believe that the authorities in this field are the ones that already exist.
So there are two.
What you'd use. Yeah.
So I have two answers to that question. So the first is that the research actually shows that you don't need it in every class, right? That students with enough exposure through a few classes get it. And that you don't really have to, bake it into everything. You don't need to worry about that for your students to be prepared. And incidentally, if you bake it into enough classes, they will raise it in the classes themselves where it is missing. And that's something I've seen in my classes where the students come back and they say, I just raised this in my other class because none of it had been covered at all. So they sort of take care of it for you. So that's the first piece. And you don't need to kill yourself to get to 100%. The second thing is in the places that have been the earliest movers about this, and the one I think of is the Fletcher School, because they had put in their focus field many years ago on gender. What they said is, like any environment, you have a spectrum. You have the people who are diehard, who believe this, to their core and will do anything and have done it on their own, all the way over to people who are always going to be non-believers, right? It's like any environment. And then in between, there's a vast middle. And so what they found was, you focus on getting to whatever, 60%, 65%, and you get to sort of a tipping point where the people who you're talking about are kind of outliers. And they, gradually either they come around or they're such a small minority that they're almost isolated, over here. And so their advice was, don't worry about that 15% because the 15% will be swamped by the 85. And if you do your service to the 85, then you'll get it taken care of. And so the research and that sort of anecdotal evidence, but is kind of persuasive. And so I think those are two items. I think the third is obviously doesn't mean you don't speak to these people. I mean, you want to try and move that agenda. And what you may, what you have to talk about is what is possible. And it may be that you can only get them to touch on these issues and their existence. And it may be that you can only get some of it into recommended readings. And it may be that all they will accept is that they should perhaps have some women scholars on their syllabus and not much more than that. And it's still going to be on the very narrow gauge topics. But even that progress is a start. And you need to meet people where they are. I think the one, and this was one of the deans said, and I think it is really important for us all to keep in mind, is that it is not a matter of academic freedom for someone not to teach students knowledge they need to know. That's not academic freedom. And so we have to a little bit draw lines in the sand around what it is we say people simply have to have a basic understanding of. We wouldn't say that an elementary school teacher has a right not to teach addition because it's their academic freedom. And so this mass of evidence that has been developed showing that this matters, and it matters in every imaginable dimension of the international affairs field, means we have to be teaching it.
Great, thank you. And I see that there's another question that has popped up in the chat. I can read it out loud for Carmen. It says, Carla, we've talked a lot about sequencing change, particularly as regards internal culture change, but not exclusively so. Do you have best practices for where to start?
So that's a really hard question to answer on a general level, because each school environment and ecosystem is different. And I'll explain what I mean. If you have a very small, very non-diverse faculty, it is awfully hard to move the composition of your school quickly, right? There's just, it's very hard to get the faculty lines and make those kinds of changes in that way. And so in that circumstance, you can focus a lot on culture in your curriculum, and try to create as embracing an environment as possible. And you're also going to probably want to start by involving your students in that process, because in all likelihood, your student population and staff population is more diverse than your faculty population is. And so that's a way that you want to go. If you have a very traditional program, but you have a relatively diverse composition in your school, then it may be that you can move on issues of culture more quickly and with greater need than you can on some of the other issues like your curriculum, because your expertise may just not necessarily open the door to moving that as quickly. So I think it really depends. I think the strategy, so I'd approach it a slightly different way. I would say the strategy should be led by two primary factors. The areas of greatest need as defined by some kind of a baseline analysis, and the opportunities for some quick wins, so that you're showing a commitment to trying to move the agenda forward in ways that are visible. And whatever it is you're doing, communication is absolutely essential, because durable change takes time and often isn't that visible. And so you need to be telling people what it is you're doing so that they understand you're working really hard, even though it's going to take some time. And in the case of graduate schools, people are gone very quickly. And so the alumni become really important to helping with the narrative of how things have transformed and improved. Now, you guys have a lot of undergraduates as well. And so they're there longer. And in some ways that creates a really nice ecosystem with students who are willing and eager to move the agenda forward. And I found at Georgetown, having done this over a few years, that there are fantastic students who I've been working with now for 2 or 3 years, who are, serving on the committees within the school, who are active in the extracurricular organizations, who are research assistants to me, or student aides to the vice dean. And we're really a team, right? We're really, the students and faculty, instructors and administrators are really working together over a period of years to transform an institution. And that's incredibly rewarding and exciting. But how you approach that will vary from place to place.
Great. I'm just going to say real quick before I hand it back to Kylie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your comments so much. You have just an amazing amount of knowledge in this area. And now I'm going to hand it over to Kylie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I agree with Rolly, and I know we're all very grateful that you were able to share pieces of your expertise and wisdom. I know we could have this conversation for a lot longer and keep picking your brain, so we'll have to have you come back and spend more time with us. But thank you so much for being here today. And for those who are on the call, we will be sharing the recording. And Carla, if you're comfortable, maybe a PDF of the slides as well, so folks can see some of that great content. Thank you all for joining us today. And we just have 2 more sessions on the horizon if you're interested. There's a Latinx and Hispanic affinity space happening at noon, and then our closing keynote with Dean Ayers and Senior Advisor Bishop Garrison at 1 o'clock. And you can visit our website, go.gw.edu/IEW 2021. I'll put it in the chat if you want to see the full schedule. But thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to Carla for your time today.
Well, thank you all so much. And please, if I can be helpful, feel free to reach out. I am here to be of service. And I think it's great that you guys are doing all of these conversations. Congratulations on a terrific week.
Thank you so much.